This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are going to talk about inventing characters. So, you got nothing. You are starting at ground level. Where do our characters come from? Invention. Yeah. Kathryn, I'm going to throw it to you. I don't know. I feel like you have something good to say about this.
Where do characters come from? My characters primarily come from a lot of free writing. So yeah. I heartily believe in I love what you say, Alida, with I don't know what to write, I don't know what to write, I don't know what to write, because eventually you will know what to write. I think I just think about what my character needs to be, and then they just start going from there. But primarily a lot of free writing, and then I can sort of define that into an actual character once I have a whole bunch of generation on the page.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, I think that is primarily what I do too. Robert, do you have a different starting point for character invention?
I'm not sure. It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because, sometimes a story starts with an idea of a scene or something like that, but to have a scene, you have to have a character in there. So where do they come from? And if, whether we're talking main or not, I definitely first drafting, I'll have the scene plotted out and then feel like something has to happen. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you're writing a character in, and I'm sure this is an extraordinarily common experience that then ends up becoming an integral character to the story. So I suppose, again, I've leaned into this a bit before, there's the unconscious parts of us that play a role in creating story have to be expressed somewhere. So that kind of leads back to what Kathryn was saying, is that if you free write, then eventually you're what's buried in there is going to say, look, finally, I've got a voice.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes it's better to write to find the characters, and there are those writers who say, I just let my characters tell me what to do in the story, which I think is really lame personally, but anyway, that's a personal opinion.
The opinions expressed on this show are very opinionated today.
But it's definitely true that when you're drafting, for sure, things come out of nowhere and you go, wow, where did that happen? And it's I don't know, and I don't know if we need to know the why,
right? But
it seems it comes from the activity. And we used to, when I was teaching presentation skills and teaching trainers to be trainers, a lot of people have a fear of drying up. Some people are the other way around, that they fear that they just rabbit on for too long, but a lot of people have a fear of drying up. And so I would often force them to do that. Say, okay, what happens when you dry up? And you'll see they'll just do this. And for anybody who's just listening, all I did was freeze in space. And what happens is that our I don't know, synaptic pathways, something just, hits a dead end or goes into a loop, and you can't escape. And the trick to it is to physically move. And it's the same with writing. The trick to it is to write more words if you get stuck. Or, as you've heard many people say, get up, go for a walk, go in the shower, and all of a sudden, boom, you've got those ideas coming in. So I think what I'm leading to is, I think it's really hard to sit in front of your computer screen saying, okay, I need a character.
Right.
What should I start with? Well, they're going to have black hair. It's totally irrelevant. These character development things where, people get fussed on what they look like and what they studied at university. And, yes, it's nice to know their traumas and their wounds. And as we flesh things out later on, that's fine. But character comes from action.
Right.
And so, that whole idea of writing or moving yourself, I think that's what brings things out that are more than just your main character. Or if you've just got an idea for the scene, go and act out the scene.
Right.
See what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. I always say to start with what before who, because if you have an idea of what your story is, then you know you need a character to do something. So what does that character need to do? And that is going to inform the traits and the qualities that you need to develop in that character. And we are in the plot class right now. We're reading True Grit by Charles Portis. And I was just saying the other day that, you know, he probably didn't sit down and say, I want to write a coming-of-age story about a 14-year-old girl in the 1870s. He probably thought, I'm going to write a Western. It's going to be a story of vengeance set in the wilds of Indian Territory in the 19th century. And then he thought, who would be the least likely protagonist in that scenario? I know. A 14-year-old girl with her hair in braids and, you know, a rod up her back who is so prim and proper and yet so tough, who's just going to surprise everyone at every turn. And what a fun starting point for a character to go, okay, I'm really excited about this scenario. Not who can fulfill that duty, but who's going to surprise me and my readers and all of the other characters as she goes through this arc, fulfilling all of these plot elements.
Yeah, and I would also say that it's an innovation. It's a completely innovative book because of not just that, but let's say he didn't start with that idea. Let's say he thought, I'm going to write this Western. It's going to be set in Indian Territory. It's going to be really dangerous and lawless, and the big issue is going to be this grizzled, alcoholic, kind of quite mercenary, deputy or ex-deputy who's just, barely making it through and has to go after a villain. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's kind of same. Is that just to try it? But if you then say, well, what narrative device can I use to bring that story to life? I'll tell it through the eyes of a 14-year-old girl. And then from there you go, oh, hang on a minute, I make the 14-year-old girl the main character, So I think you could even start with a fairly banded around current popular idea. Maybe it's Twilight, right? Yeah. So you go, Twilight, God, that was boring. I'm going to write a vampire love story. But what can I do that's different? What can I do that innovates that? Is there a different way that can be used, narrated? Is there a different way to have the hero? And we've seen people do that. We've seen people mess with that and twist it around and reboot. So I think sometimes character can come from frustrations with current stories or thinking about how you can twist a pre-existing convention or even just a single trope. And I think True Grit's a great example of that. Definitely. It
is. Yeah, and I think there's a danger inherent in this as a writer if you approach your story from the vantage point of how can I take something familiar and make it different, but you also need to do the work of developing that character into a real
yes.
living, breathing human being, fictional character, right? But that is what distinguishes a book like True Grit from loads of other stories that, where the character didn't become real, where the character remained conceptual. Right? Like, oh, I'm going to be different. I'm going to be, yeah.
But, I think you have to take, I think you have to take what your story needs and what your other characters, so like maybe you already have like your Rooster Cogburn and you already have some of the other players, then you have to take what does my story need? What does he need in order to be more interesting? And I don't think you can get more interesting than having this grizzled old marshal interacting with a young girl, right? Because they're so dichotomous. And I think if you start looking at your story from that point of view, even if it's, much lighter or easier story to look at, you can say, okay, like my protagonist, what do they need in their life in order to complicate them, to push them, to have that dichotomy, so that you can really start bringing some of that inner conflict as well as the external conflict that you already know is happening. So,
right. And it's important that Rooster Cogburn is not one-dimensional, you know, so even while he's telling Maddie that she's just a little itty-bitty thing and her gun is too big for her and he doesn't take child's money and all that, from the get-go he calls her sis, little sis. I mean, you aren't quite my equal, but you're family, you're kin to me, and little sis, I'm going to look out for you, I'm going to keep you safe. And all of the other characters who, you know, disregard her, look down on her, think she's childish and incompetent until proven otherwise. You know, none of them have that quality. None of them have that perspective that Rooster brings to his relationship with Maddie. And that really makes their partnership exceptional. And I won't spoil this one, oddly enough, but it makes the climax meaningful. You know, it leads up to, it's like Han Solo turning around and going back to the battle instead of just taking the money and running, right? It makes sense.
Definitely. I mean, we talked about relationship of side characters and lovable characters, you know, in the last episode. This one's even more interesting, where that innovation on the Western has become quite a tight-knit story of relationship and connection. So, you know, I think I like what Kathryn said is, you know, what does your story need? You could think about what kind of connection and disconnection would push my protagonist around, or challenge their beliefs, or push them into a situation where they're forced to make a bad choice, or irreconcilable choices, you know. And again, Han Solo's decision to turn around is one of those. You know, he could have just gone on and been selfish, but lived with the guilt of knowing that he'd effectively contributed to the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives or more.
Right.
Or he could swing back and be noble, which he hates doing because it's not his public persona, but it kind of is really buried in him somewhere.
Right.
Like, geez, did you have to make me do this? You know, and so he kind of does it begrudgingly, but we love that about him. You know, so it's a sort of you know, you definitely. You can show so many different faces, I think, with characters, that I like Kathryn's idea of, you know, what does your story need? And I think I would push that to, you know, what does your protagonist need?
Right. Yeah. And it's great to backfill. So as you're doing your journaling and as you're answering those questions of who is this character, what is the character's backstory, the character's wounds, it's all serving that story and addressing that question of what does my story need? What does my protagonist need? You know, so if I need the partner, the primary supporting character who's going to do a U-turn and come back to fight, or who's going to rescue the protagonist at the 9th hour, or whatever that is, you've got to develop that person. Right. And it's got to be consistent. We need continuity throughout the entire arc of the book.
Yeah. I wonder why J.K. Rowling chose to have sort of, you know, Harry Potter have two very strong, you know, supporting characters in there. Because, you know, you think, what would that have been like if it was just he and Ron, for example, or he and Hermione? So something must have happened during that writing process where, and maybe it's something to do with kids' experience of school as well. You know, you get these small cluster friendship groups that are tightly knit and straightforward sort of gender equality, I guess, as well. You know, making sure that there was a girl character in there too that, you know, people could connect with.
Right. I think those are both great points. But also, if you look at the scale of the story Hogwarts is a massive place, and it's a 7-book arc, which she knew at the beginning of writing that it was going to be a book per school year. And it ends in a war, in an epic battle. So she needed to populate it big enough, broadly enough to meet the demands of that story, whereas in something like True Grit, it's a manhunt. You only need so many people on your manhunt, right? And it's that plausibility factor. What's reasonable for the plot to play out.
In addition, though, something interesting with that is that although it is Hogwarts' massive school, right? The dormitory for each year only has 6 boys, right? So you can get to know the smaller group, and it doesn't become massive. So it's, again, what does the story need? It needs the feel of a massive school, but then we need to be able to name all of his schoolmates in the same year with him, right? And it can't be, counting for 15 minutes. It's okay, we know the 6 boys that he has gone up through the 7 years with, right? So there's kind of that back and forth of how many characters to create.
Right. I always felt like, my high school experience, there were 500 students in my graduating class, and I knew a handful of them. So even though we only saw the dorm room that Harry shared with those 4 to 6 boys who were in his year, they were the ones we could name and recognize in the hallway. But I always assumed his class was much bigger, and that, so on the scale of Hogwarts, but it raises a great point, Kathryn, that we need to keep things manageable for our readers. And so you start with Ron and Hermione and Malfoy, and Malfoy's sidekick. So you've kind of got the opposing sides there. But then we get to know Hogwarts better. We get comfortable in that world and with the magic system. And now we start bringing in layers of supporting characters, and the teams get bigger. Everything sort of scales up. The relationships, the conflict, the world just keeps expanding. So it's like you get a handle on this. Okay, here comes more. You get a handle on that. Here comes more. And it feels manageable because of that layering.
I find that it's one of my issues is that I will, and for anyone writing a longer series, is you need something. So like as Kathryn said, what does your story need? You write a new character in, and before you know it, you think you got 50 characters you're juggling left, right, and centre. And, when I first started writing, I used to do these beat sheets, reverse beat sheets. So I'd do the draft, and then I'd go back and divvy it all up into sort of beats, more or less scenes, really, and because it was multi-POV, I'd have that particular story of the series was multi-POV. I would then list out, when was the protagonist on stage and when were the antagonists on stage, and I realised I'd just gone, 12 scenes, maybe 5 chapters where the antagonist is apparently sitting around twiddling their thumbs. So you've got to have them doing it, or a reason for it, or them doing something, or if not, at least them appearing to be referenced on stage by the main characters, so that there's some evidence that the enemy's closing in, or we've just heard this or that. So I think, where do your characters come from? They definitely they arise as the story evolves, and it can be challenging for those writing grand scale, enormous series, because at some point you're probably going to have to tie all those up as well. My mind boggles at how the Marvel Cinematic Universe writes. I mean, that's why you have a writer's room, so you've got lots of people, lots of hands on deck, just making sure that nothing falls through the cracks.
Yes. Yeah, and I think they've got a person designated to do that, the continuity person.
Well, that's that too. That's right.
Yeah. Yes. And as novelists, it's all on us. Going it on there.
We're off the rails of, we're inventing characters, but I suppose that as you talk about that, they evolve, really. And either they suddenly appear out of nowhere because you're writing, or they appear out of necessity because you need something in the story. And so we all have this, I think, maybe a romantic idea that people sit in an armchair and suddenly dream up these extraordinary characters. Wow, if only I thought of Harry Potter. But that in reality, that isn't how it happens.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, Robert, because it might be the case with a character like Sherlock Holmes, where you think, or Doctor Who, where you've got such an incredible character at the center of everything. So then you're building plots around the character's abilities, in order to showcase that character's abilities. And that's also why you have the arcless protagonist, because you want to keep showcasing those abilities and that incredible talent of that character. But for everyone else, I think it's what do we need to happen in this story? And I do have a story that began with the vision of two characters together in a room, but then I had to ask questions. Who are these? What's happening in this scene? Why are they here? What led up to this? So who, what, and why all sort of swirl around each other and take us back to that journaling and the free writing process to explore the inspiration.
Sometimes a story will come from an idea, will come from a scene, but sometimes it will come from a flash of a person or a character. So I think it's you've got to leave yourself open to lots of different things. Where do characters come from? Who knows? Sometimes they are your starting point. Sometimes they are your what you pick up along the way.
Right. Any other thoughts on starting characters? We're going to devolve into nodding heads here, so.
Well, maybe only at this moment in time in the world, we need lots of heroes. So keep writing the heroes.
Excellent. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.